And here's Lesson 8 of Unit 3 entitled The Road to Revolution. So our teach that we can put events from 1770 to 1775 in chronological order, that we can analyze how British actions such as the Tea Act and the Intolerable Acts helped cause the American Revolution, that we can look at details of events such as the First and Second Continental Congresses, and finally that we can analyze the impact of the Boston Tea Party as an act of civil disobedience and the reasons that it happened. So let's continue. So after the Boston Massacre, the British hoped things would calm down, and for a number of years they did. However, while this was going on, the colonial leaders continued to unite and form a network in protest. They formed committees of correspondence, and this was an information network throughout the colonies in which letters were carried from one committee to the other by horseback in all the colonies. And this groups also functioned a leadership role in which they organized responses to British actions, maintained boycotts, reported on British actions and troop movements, and essentially they acted sort of like an underground shadow government beneath the official British government. That period of calm, however, came to an end with the Boston Tea Party. In 1773, the British East India Company, which was a major corporation in Britain, found itself stuck with a large amount of unsold tea and was near bankruptcy. So Parliament decided to help them by passing the Tea Act. This required the colonists to buy British tea. It was twofold. One was to stop American tea smuggling, and the tea was sold to the colonies at a very cheap rate, so they believed the colonies would actually see this as a positive. However, it angered the colonists and it united patriots with the businessmen, many of whom were actually smuggling this tea smugglers and were profiting from this. So the patriots and businessmen united against the British. In December 1773, about 60 of the Sons of Liberty, dressed as natives, boarded these ships and dumped the British tea into Boston Harbor at a loss of over $1 million in product. Now, King George III was furious at this act. He saw this as an act of vandalism and just pure criminal mischief. And he vowed to punish Massachusetts and also to make an example of Massachusetts for the other colonies. So the British passed in 1774, they passed the Coercive Acts. To coerce somebody is to force them to do something. So one, they closed Boston Harbor. This was a major center of trade for the colonies, so closing that off. They abolished the Massachusetts Assembly and brought Massachusetts under military rule. So Massachusetts lost the right of representative self-government. They installed a harsher quartering act and forbid trials of British officials. So we look back to the Boston Massacre and the trial of the 8 soldiers. There would be no more trials in the colonies of British soldiers. The colonies called these the Intolerable Acts. Again, intolerable means to not be accepted. So the Intolerable Acts, and they vowed to respond. So in September 1774, representatives from 12 of the colonies, Georgia was not there, met in the First Continental Congress to respond to these acts. They pledged a boycott. We've discussed what boycott means in Lesson 7. And that they would no longer export products to Britain. So no more business with Britain. No British imports, no American exports. They encouraged Massachusetts to form a government and to also form a militia. So for the first time, we're talking about armed resistance to British rule. And they promised together that they would defend Massachusetts if it was attacked. And they began stockpiling weapons and ammo in secret locations. Which leads us to the Battle of Lexington and Concord. The military governor of Massachusetts found out about this stockpiling weapons, and he ordered British troops to Concord for 2 reasons. One was to capture the weapons, and 2 was to arrest Sam Adams and John Hancock, 2 prominent Sons of Liberty. The colonists, however, were tipped off to this. Paul Revere and William Dawes rode through the night to warn the militia in the famous Midnight Ride. So on April 19, 1775, a colonial militia fought British troops at the Battle of Lexington and Concord, and we'll talk more about the details of that battle in our next lesson. But what makes this important is we now have the first battle of the American Revolution, and, well, it's on. So moving toward independence, on May 10, 1775, shortly after Lexington and Concord, representatives meet in the Second Continental Congress. They decide to join their state militias together to form the Continental Army, and they appoint Virginian George Washington as its commander. If you remember, George Washington, besides being a prominent politician and planter, was also a military hero on the side of the British, actually, in the French and Indian War. They also appointed a committee of 5 men to draft the Declaration of Independence, so we see the beginnings of the formation of an independent American government in this meeting. But while this is going on, the colonists themselves remain divided over the question of independence. In one group, we have the Patriots, which you also call themselves the Whigs, and they favored independence. Patriots tended to live in New England, Virginia, to be farmers and laborers, which means middle class, and they were about 40% of the population. Then we get the Loyalists, who also called themselves the Tories, and these remained loyal to Britain. The Loyalists were located more in the cities, especially New York City, which was very, very loyal to Britain. The South, we mentioned how when we were in Unit 2, how the South was more like Old England and therefore maintained greater ties to the English tradition. Older people, wealthy people, clergy, recent immigrants, more tended to be loyalists. And then you get the neutrals. These were people who disliked British policies just like the Patriots did, but the idea of independence, well, they just weren't too sure about that. So if we combine those two, the loyalists who opposed independence and those who were neutral, we see that the majority of colonists, even while all this is going on, even after the Battle of Lexington and Concord, still are not sure or do not favor independence. So our Lesson 8 thoughts. What colonial actions and British policies helped unite the colonies after the Boston Massacre? What do the Intolerable Acts and the Continental Congresses show about relations between Britain and the colonies in the 1770s? And after Lexington and Concord, do you think a peaceful solution was still possible? And think about that and be able to defend your answer. And that's going to take us on into the war in our next lesson. The revolution begins.